Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Sarah Bolton, the Managing Principal of Government Affairs here at Raben. We are so glad you could be here with us today. The response to this town hall was frankly overwhelming in a really good way, which tells us that this is a crucial conversation to be having at this point in time. We hope that this moment finds you all doing as well as possible. But we at Raven know that if you lead or are part of a nonprofit organization, this is a very scary and tumultuous time. Our goal here today is really to try to make sense of the moment, as well as to give you some concrete steps and tools that you can take away. I want to say a few quick words about Raven and who we are. Then we will move on to introduce our amazing panelists and we'll engage in some conversation and then we'll take questions from you all. For those who haven't had the privilege of that we haven't had the privilege of getting to know, Raven is a DC-based public affairs firm. In addition to DC, we have locations in New York, California, Texas, and Ohio. Our firm is led by and primarily comprised of people of color, women, LGBTQ folks, and first and second generation immigrants. And many of us hold multiple of those identities. And that's really part of our secret sauce, in addition to being driven by our values of strategy, integrity, humor, equity, and compassion. Our work is values driven. We partner with clients who work to move public policy in a sensible and humane direction. And our team, if I'm allowed to say so, is top notch. They have held positions in the highest levels of state and federal government. They're smart, they're compassionate, and they make me feel grateful to work alongside them every day. I'm joined by some of those colleagues, our fantastic founder, Robert Raben, Christy McHenry, who's the managing principal of strategic communications. She is a whiz at handling communications during crises, relevant right now, and Candace Phoenix, a principal in our government affairs practice area, who comes to us with extensive government oversight and investigations experience. I want to spend as much time with you all as possible, but if you want fuller bios, they can be found on our website. As you can tell, we have the right folks at the table. So I want to dive right into our conversation to gather as much wisdom as we can from these folks and to take audience questions. Please do feel free to drop questions as they come to you in the Q&A function. So I would love to start with you, Candace. Can you just tell us what specific legislative or regulatory actions the Trump administration has taken that directly threaten nonprofit organizations?
Sure, happy to take that, Sarah, and happy to be here with you all today. The easiest part of what you just asked is what specific legislative action have they taken? And the answer is on the legislative piece, not very much, because this administration is really operating mostly with executive power and not legislative power. The one sort of legislative thing I think we need to be on the lookout for next year is going to be the upcoming budget fights that folks are having about what the federal budget will look like and the funding cuts there. Otherwise, pretty much everything we've seen has been executive action. And I'll sort of categorize the number of different kinds of threats we've seen. The first big bucket has been really financial threats, and that's come in the form mostly from DOGE early on of funding freezes, of funding scrutiny. And by that, I mean, you'll see a lot of agencies who have grants to nonprofits out who are sending out requests that those grantees certify that they are in compliance with various executive actions like anti-DEI initiatives and whatnot. We've seen funding cancellations where parts of federal agencies have just been shut down because they've been deemed unimportant or not the priorities, and the attendant money that comes from those organizations is also gone. And then we've obviously seen some budget cuts coming down the pike. Most of those so far have been, most of the financial threats have come mostly from DOGE. But we've also seen a loss of support has come. And by that, I mean, you've got organizations that have been trying to reach out to federal agencies and find those agencies gutted. And there's literally nobody to answer their calls on the other end, even if they do have funding. We've seen some investigations being launched out of DOJ, out of IRS, out of it's still DOJ, but from the local U.S. Attorney's Office. There was Ed Martin here in D.C. who has launched an investigation into Wikimedia and has tried with a couple of universities. So we see some investigations happening as well. We've seen threats to nonprofit status with concerns about 501c3s losing that status, which has devastating effects on their ability to raise money and to operate. We've seen concerns about independence. Again, this one is one that comes from DOGE. There was a story a few weeks ago that broke that DOGE was trying to install someone at the Vera Institute, a nonprofit, because that was a place that was getting federal funding. And there have been rumors that DOJ would wants to have similar effects at any place that does have major federal funding streams. And of course, there's also the always present concern about lawsuits. As a lawyer, that's where my mind usually goes. So those are the sorts of categories of threats that we're seeing, and they're coming from DOJ, they're coming from IRS, they're coming from DOJ, from other executive branch agencies. The thing I want people to be aware of is that a lot of times things will start in the executive branch, but then they'll go what I call investigatively viral, which is that one person starts talking about something, and then there are going to be other pieces of the federal infrastructure or the state infrastructure who are going to want to get in on that action. So we saw a hearing on Capitol Hill about Wikimedia. Then on top of that has come Ed Martin's investigation out of the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. And people should be aware that what they're seeing at the federal level, if it's not hitting them yet, it will. And it also could happen to them at the congressional level, but then also from the state governors, from state AGs, and from state and local legislatures too, who are looking to get in on the action.
That's a lot. We're obviously going to be fighting these attacks on many fronts. And I would love, Robert, for you just help us to make a little bit of sense of this. In what are the Trump administration's motives for these types of attacks on civil society? What is in it for them? Why are they doing this?
Sure. And Sarah and others, thank you so much for convening this. And we're just so honored that so many people are hungry, sadly, for the information that we are providing today. A little bit of backdrop. Speaking of backdrop, if there's noise, I'm in a train station, and I hope you appreciate the drama, and it's not too much. The pulling the lens back, the last time we've seen this sort of concentrated federal power or attempts at power was in the Reagan administration, and Reagan and Bush had this fantastic symbiosis between the moral majority, conservatives, and Chamber of Commerce, two very powerful communities that sort of came together and made a deal. One was interested in a war on taxation of capital gains and sort of lowering taxation. The other was interested in much more government involvement with respect to what we then called homosexuality and what we still call abortion and other issues. And they made a deal, and they got a governing coalition. Each looked the other way at the other's excesses. What we have now is a more complicated deal. There's a group of people who have been assiduously cultivating for years an effort to dismantle progressivism. And that's everything effectuated from the environment to reproductive rights to sort of the evolving notion of what a family is, and certainly around race. And Project 2025, which they abjured and said they had nothing to do with, in fact, they rely on. And so the bad news, good news is we have a blueprint for all of the social policy things that they want. And the other part of the equation is an accumulation of power, and TBD, whether it's about profit, transactionalism. It's certainly alarming that the president has clearly commodified, like made money off of his governing. And others will sort of investigate the propriety of that. But you have a fusion now of people who have been true believers about dismantling progressivism and a group of people who are about accumulating power to use government for their own benefit. And sadly, that's what we face.
Really helpful. Thank you, Robert. And we'll ask a little bit more for some history lessons as we move forward. Candace, there was a big flurry of conversation last week when we heard that there might be some executive orders that could impact nonprofit organizations. Most of those executive orders did not come to be, but what are we hearing? What can we expect to be coming down the pike in terms of future attacks on nonprofits, and what levers can the federal government, what do they have for these attacks? You spoke a little bit to that, but what do you anticipate happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind when we talk about what might be coming is that as people often say, the cruelty is the point, but in some ways, the chaos is the point. Steve Bannon, who's one of Trump's chief advisors, has talked about what he calls muzzle velocity, which is the idea that you should move so fast and on so many different fronts that people will get confused and they'll get overwhelmed and they won't know what to do and how to respond. And a lot of the rumors that we're hearing, it's unclear if any of that has a basis in fact, or if it's just people worrying and getting spun up, or the administration deliberately sowing concerns. And then on top of that, this administration is pivoting on a dime constantly. And so even if what we are hearing is actually what they're talking about, will it come to pass? Who knows? Because this administration is not the most organized, if you haven't noticed. But in terms of what we have been hearing so far, we heard a lot of chatter around an EO, around green groups and environmental justice, and whether or not those that particular industry was going to be targeted for loss of 501c3 status or other sorts of things. That did not come to pass. It was supposed to be coming around Earth Day. It didn't come to fruition. But I think what's interesting about that is thinking about that as a very specific industry that they're targeting. And you can see that methodology potentially being used for other industries. You could see this administration deciding, okay, we're going to do the same thing with immigration groups, or we're going to target groups that focus on LGBTQ plus organizations and populations. They're doing a very subject matter based attack. And so that's the one thing I would keep in mind and keep an eye on when it comes to those that attack on green groups. We've also seen some concern about there being a further gutting or cancellation of PSLF, the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which doesn't have a direct effect on nonprofits, but given that that is one of the things that makes it financially possible for a lot of people to actually work at nonprofits, it will have an indirect and devastating effect if that were to come down the pike. We've heard about there being additional EOs regarding grants or funding from or to foreign sources. And we've seen that come up so far, mostly with regards to universities and to political donations. That's what actually came to fruition last week. There was a specific mention of Act Blue, which I'm sure people have heard about in one of the executive orders, but there's concerns that that might go and get a lot broader. So if you're a nonprofit that gets money from a foreign source, or if you're a nonprofit that funds a project overseas, you'll see a lot of some concerns about attacks in that vein, similar to what we were hearing around USAID, the sense that like foreign aid is both dirty and a waste of time and money. Of course, their argument then was that public dollars should not be paying for that, but the attack on nonprofits indicates they don't think anybody should be paying for that. So I think that really sort of gives away the game. And we've also heard rumors about concerns about making it easier to designate nonprofits as terrorist support groups, particularly as it relates to anti-Semitism or what's happening in Gaza. And then finally, we've heard rumors about there being attacks on specific progressive donors and organizations, specific foundations, the same way that you've seen, and I know we're going to get into this a little bit, some attacks calling out specific law firms or specific universities. There have been concerns that there will be similar attacks on specific nonprofits or other donors or foundations.
Thank you so much, Candace. And on that point, most folks probably know that we're already seeing serious attacks by the administration on some specific universities and law firms. Chrissy, we would love to hear from you. What are the lessons to be learned from their responses so far?
Thanks, Sarah, and hi, everyone. I think there's a few pieces. I mean, one, I think often both in my work, but also as I've observed this all unfolding, is that organizations have to think about, sort of what their values are and how they want to display them. What's their tolerance for risk? What's the internal calculus in terms of their staff and their own sort of brand and brand presence? And then how does that show itself? And so that's one of the things, that I think, sort of folks are really sort of having to think about and sometimes to rethink, right? And so, sort of in the moment, whether it's out of fear or isolation or a sense of being isolated, you may have one response. And then over time, as we've started to see people begin to coalesce, either by sector, by community, geographically, whatever are the possible, sort of computations. And then, maybe we'll start to see some traction. So, I think we saw early on with the universities, for example, sort of a very fractured response. And in the last couple of weeks, we've begun to see a more consolidated approach to, sort of beginning to fight back against some of these, sort of infringements on sort of fundamental pieces of the work that they do, and their very presence in the fabric of American society from the very, some of whom predate the founding of the U.S. So, it's an interesting notion as organizations think about how they're going to both show up themselves and then how do they partner with and how do they achieve, whether it's protection or economy of scale, or, sort of whatever are the pieces that go into that calculation. But that's an important piece as we see organizations think about, sort of what they want to do. And then what's at risk if they don't, right? I mean, what's at risk to their own self and sense of self? What's at risk to how the contract they have as institutions or organizations with the people who work with them, who have been part of their orbit, whether it's alumni, et cetera. And then, the notion of these institutions as, sort of American, sort of fundamentally American projects and courses of work. And what if they were gone?
Thank you, Chrissy. I would love to hear from one of our two legal brains, Candace or Robert, on what legal challenges to these types of executive orders we can expect if they do come to fruition, and what should nonprofits do if there's an executive order that would greatly impact the way that they run their organization, but there's a period of legal limbo. Is it business as usual? Should they be doing something different?
Go ahead, Candace. Or I'm happy to. I'll start, but I listened to Governor Wes Moore this morning at the Black Economic Alliance point out, and it was inspiring and a little glib, but it was really, really powerful that the executive orders thus far have either been ineffectual, performative, or unconstitutional. From sort of his lips to God's ears. Lawyers are, notwithstanding our brand, really an enormously important part of the cohort, because so much of what they're doing is aggressively testing the law. They know that much, but not all, this is bullying aside, I'm just talking about the law here. Much of what they're doing is trying to intimidate people toward a certain goal. And on the law, they know they are testing it in court. So TBD, what ultimately the courts do with a lot of these clearly unconstitutional provisions. For example, they have grossly over-inferred the Harvard SSFA University of North Carolina affirmative action case. That case stood ultimately for the proposition that you can be race conscious in admissions. You just have to have a particularized showing between the race of the candidate and the decision. What they have done is take that decision and say you can have no race consciousness in any of the civil rights statutes. And so DOJ and EEOC are sending letters to law firms and employers saying you can't consider race ever, which is not what the law is. This is going on across the board. And so people are going to have to be a little patient as the courts work out what the brakes are on this aggression in trying to change law. What should not-for-profits be doing? You should be working with your trade associations to the extent you have, and they are getting better and better at being prepared. You should sort of put out a bolo or be on the lookout for like-minded NGOs in your space across the country that may be further along. There's sort of an each one, teach one thing going on. There's now NGO solidarity, and people like Vanita Gupta have done the Lord's work, helping organize NGOs and getting resources out there. If you don't have those resources, email us, we will get them to you. I'll stop.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. Candace, how do you think funders and fiscal sponsors could be impacted in the coming months by potential attacks, and how could nonprofits expect that to trickle down to their work?
Yeah, so I think the top concern for most funders and fiscally sponsored projects is one, losing 501c3 status, and two, getting their assets frozen, because those two things can really be devastating to certain organizations. If you lose your status, I know some people think it's just the kind of thing that determines how you file when tax season comes, and that doesn't have an immediate effect, but it does, because that determines whether or not you're actually getting money coming in the door when people actually want to donate to you. If you don't have that 501c3 status, or it's in limbo, it's going to be really difficult for you to convince people to continue donating to you. And so some of the things that people are going to want to think about is, are there other places to direct that money if you do get that threat? And that is going to trickle down, because if the foundation or the parent organization for a lot of fiscally sponsored projects that have their 501c3 status nestled under the parent organization, then that could have a devastating trickle down or cascading effect where you have the parent foundation losing 501c3 status, and then every single project that's underneath that could also lose that status immediately. And then the asset freezing is obviously equally devastating, if not more in some cases, because then you have issues about whether or not you can pay the rent, whether you can pay your staff, whether you can continue to fund the programs that you have out there. So those seem to be the two biggest concerns facing people right now. I'll note that the suspension of status and that the asset freezing is not supposed to be automatic. There is a process in place that is supposed to be followed, and we can talk more about that if folks would like. Obviously, the caveat right now is the question with this administration is not whether what they're doing is legal. The question is who's going to stop them, because there's a lot of process in place that is not getting followed. But that's where what Robert was just saying, the lawyers come in handy, because the first thing you should do when you get these kinds of inquiries or this happens to you, call your lawyer, go to court, and try to get a TRO or preliminary injunction immediately.
Thank you, Candace. Chrissy, what are the best practices when if an attack was to happen to one of our nonprofit organizations, let's say with us today, what are the best practices for communicating both internally and externally?
So I think a couple of things. I mean, one, sort of to the extent one can is to prepare, right? So to do some scenario planning so that you are as nimble as possible. And that means really sort of thinking about, what are the possible actions that might come? How would you respond? In terms of how do you think about who might come to your defense? What would you say about your own organization and its place in the community? What would you say to staff? What would you ask of them, et cetera? And sort of having a sense of that. And at the same time, not being paralyzed as we wait, right? So it is a piece of the work that we do now is to prepare for these moments, but it is not all of the work that we do. So, sort of having that balance is an important sort of thing, because if we only focus on the negative that we fear, we are already defeated. And we've already, sort of given ourselves away to not getting done the very work that we think is most important. So another piece is, sort of as you arrive at, and every organization has a different culture, right? So whether or not you are engaging with staff, as you consider how you'd respond, what you would say to whom, how, et cetera, that is a piece of it. Whether you're deciding in the boardroom or at the most senior levels of an organization and passing it to staff, it's still important that you are helping folks to understand how you got there, why you got there, what their contribution and role is in the process of sharing that information and carrying out wherever you've landed. And then, of course, your public persona, sort of, is it something that you want to say proactively? Is it something you want to be quiet about? So thinking about how this would all unfold is an important piece of the puzzle. And then there's the sort of the foundational pieces of an organization, your website, the materials that you share with folks. If you're doing grant proposals, what's the language you use in that? If you're doing presentations and talking to folks, interacting with different community members, or whether it's sort of policy type makers, state and local, whether it's peer organizations, whether it's members of the community, how are you presenting yourself, the work that you do, the why you do it, and for whom and with whom, and sort of how all of this is affected by where we have found ourselves.
Thank you, Chrissy. And a bit of a follow-up. I know folks are curious, there's fear right now. And I think a lot of organizations are trying to weigh whether they change their standard operating procedure. Should they be putting out press releases? Should they be hiding under a proverbial rock and just trying to carry out their mission the best they can, but not talking about it? How do they make these decisions right now?
Some may be a bit of a gut check, and some may be organizations where culturally there's much more of a process attached to it. I spoke with a foundation this morning, and sort of in conversation with them, it's like, if you want to lead, maybe you don't wait until this comes out. Maybe you talk about the environment that's been created and how both difficult it is and how destructive it is in advance, right? I mean, maybe you get out there and really take this on. And so, for each organization, it is a little bit different. And you have to think about and really think honestly about what it might mean to be in the limelight to poke the bear, so to speak, et cetera, and what that might mean for you. And for every organization, there's a different conclusion. So I don't, I think when I think about it in terms of my work, it is really sort of meeting with folks, understanding what it is they risk in speaking or not speaking, because there are risks in both, and how that, sort of plays with, either emphasizes and lifts up and amplifies their existing brand and values, or how it might diminish those.
Thank you, Chrissy. And I'm going to ask Candace what is potentially the million or billion-dollar question right now, which is, what are the specific best practices? What should nonprofits be doing at this moment as they're waiting more details on how these attacks might play out? And how should they be preparing? It feels like there's kind of a limitless amount of things that you could be doing. So how do we prioritize? What are the top, 3 things that you would recommend people do?
So one of the things that we'll be sending out after this session is a quick handout on the steps that you all can take to prepare. And some of this dovetails beautifully with what Chrissy just said. I think the first thing I'd say as part of the scenario planning is actually put the procedures in place that you are going to need to be able to respond quickly to what's coming in, and to be able to triage and decide what's important, what's not important. There's this sense of panic that everyone has because there's all this conversation about what could happen. But what you need to do is figure out how you're going to actually put things in place to take that in when it comes. That means, what are your decision trees? How are you communicating with people? What is the information that you need technologically to actually get information quickly? Because there's a lot that's not known, but you can figure out how you're going to actually decide things when they come in if you think about that a little bit beforehand. And then, as Chrissy said, really figuring out what your central value is. What is the core thing that you want to protect or promote? Because as things come in rapid fire, you're going to have to make a lot of quick decisions. But if you don't know what your North Star is, it's going to be really difficult for you to actually make those decisions. And then I'd say do essentially a self audit. You probably know where a lot of your vulnerabilities are. Do you have former employees who you think are liable to be whistleblowers? Do you have issues that have come up before and died down but could be resurrected and blown up into a much bigger problem? Do you have good compliance hygiene? Have you actually checked to make sure that you are on the right side of C1, C3 versus C4 status? Do you have business insurance? All those sorts of things that are just making sure that your house is in order, and figuring out how to, if it's not in order, get it in order before somebody comes knocking on your door. Those are the top things I would say are most important. There are additional steps that you'll see in the handout that we'll distribute. But knowing what your values are that you're defending, knowing what your goal is in terms of getting through, and knowing what your process is for deciding how to act, and then knowing where your vulnerabilities are and shoring them up, I think are the sort of core key issues for people to be thinking about right now.
So I love that. Candace, thank you so much. One of the things we're seeing, there are so many leaders on this call. Do you have a policy for social media and communications for your staff? These are not easy issues, but it's easier to deal with them on now than on defense. So what are folks out there saying, and who navigates that, if at all? What's your sort of internal rapid response if somebody in the government doesn't care for something somebody did? If one of your employees, God forbid, is looped up in a dragnet for deportation, do you have a plan for organizational response or not? I'll sort of pull the lens back for a second. This can be so obvious, but we find it to be important to say out loud how helpful it can be to have the emotional conversations at the very top of the organization. You, your board, your senior staff, where people have the opportunity to name where they think they might reasonably be if you were attacked. Now, clearly it depends on the nature of the attack and sort of where it's coming from and what the substance is. But getting on the table now a sense of, look, the mission is really important, and these are the things that we are not wanting to, but willing to compromise on. Language, practices, policies. This is a no-fly zone. Would I go to jail? I'm sorry to be so explicit, but this is where we are with many people. Would I go to jail? Am I Fannie Lou Hamer or not really? And giving ourselves grace There really isn't a right or wrong in a movement. People are at very different places in their lives at a moment in time. And the best thing your opponent wants you to do is to fight among yourself over moral supremacy. Find out in advance what your walk is, what's the connection between your head and your heart, what are you willing to do for this organization, and what are you not willing to do, so people can plan. And it may require some adjustments in advance. Thank you for the interruption.
And if I could give you a sort of pithy way to try to think about this, I try to think about it in 4 Ps. Take your panic, figure out your plan, what is your process for your plan, and then once you've done all that, pivot back to your purpose. Don't spend too much time in the panic and the plan phrase. The whole point of that is to give you a process so you can go back to your purpose.
I love that. Let's all write Candace's 4 Ps on a post-it note and put it on our laptop screen so we can remind ourselves of that every day as we are panicking. I would love to hear from you, Chrissy. What role do our trusted messengers and storytelling play in defending the legitimacy and importance of nonprofits? I mean, is it going to make a difference? What should we be doing right now if our reputations are being attacked?
I think the notion of, sort of holding tight to why it is we do the work we do, with whom, for whom, and in partnership with whom, is an important piece of this work, right? Because how we're able to activate those who stand with us, how we're able to talk to those who might be persuadable, who might not know very much about something. I mean, I think, if you look at, USAID and how it became under attack and so many people didn't know what it was. And then as they understood a little bit more, there's room and possibility. And so the idea, I think storytelling and purpose and care are ever more important in this space, because how we build coalition in this moment is important. And it doesn't require everyone to think everything that we think or to think everything that we think all the time, but for them to understand that we're talking about real people, real lives, people who have the same aspirations for their children, for their families, for their communities as everyone else, that we, sort of share some same core values and identifying what those are and lifting them up. That's an important part of reminding us of our shared humanity and the, sort of the tearing at the fabric of our, not just our lives, but our traditions and sort of core beliefs is brutal. And so we have to come together to remind ourselves of what we have in common. And so I think it's an important piece of the work. And I hope that there's joy in it. There is both, urgency in it, but there is joy in it because it reminds us, to one of Candace's key Ps, which is our purpose.
Thank you, Chrissy. And I heard you talking about coalitions. I heard you talking about coming together. We have folks I know on this call who are from very small organizations. We obviously have big dogs on this call from, many employees. They've got lawyers, they've got comms folks, but then we have others who maybe are just small organizations. How can these smaller or resource limited nonprofits build coalitions together, build power to counter broader attacks? And also, part of that question that folks are curious about is if we're part of an LGBTQ group, should we be speaking out right now or should we be designating other voices to be protecting us? Are we facing this head on or are we kind of allowing some other voices to speak for us?
I'm happy to jump in on that at a level, which is to say, sort of smaller organizations, and they are at my heart because I've come from working with many of them, really have to think about, sort of where their natural partners are and where those natural relationships are. Some are same sector within a community. Some are maybe like sort of in a different sector, but, sort of shared population that you serve or same geographic location that you sit in. But the opportunity to work together, even if at times there is competition for funds, competition for, sort of thinking about how to go about solving and working on, sort of some of the issues before us. That in this moment that we come together and think about how to combat this one thing that might keep us all from doing the work that we care about and that we think is important. So, sort of the notion of reaching out, sort of across a variety of lines, taking advantage of existing relationships, building new ones, could be a really valuable sort of piece of the work, and an opportunity for us to show some strength. And I think Robert says this all the time, like sort of in a coalition, it doesn't require everyone to think and do everything all the time the same, but to find those nuggets of shared purpose and shared intention, and to pull, sort of to gather together in those ways and to use those moments to strengthen us across other areas.
Thank you, Chrissy. Robert, I hear you talk a lot in the years that we've worked together about non-traditional allies, and I'm wondering whether this is a time that we should be hugging close non-traditional allies, folks who are not normally on our side, centrist, institutionalist. Is that a helpful tactic at this time?
It's a helpful tactic at every time. I think it's sort of a great way of living and a strategy and a value and a tactic to operate on the presumption that people agree much more than they are taught to believe. We live in a society which is profoundly encouraged to disagree. And our lived experience is not that people basically want the same things for their children, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They want security and they want safety, all that. And so the work, which gets harder and harder, is to focus on the values and the connections and the relationships and the programs which most people rally around. I'll give a sort of a specific example. They attack DEI, they attack CRT, they attack ESG. You see where this is going. They sort of take an inscrutable thing that most people haven't really focused on, demonize it, weaponize it, Willie Horton it, put the people who are in that field on defense to try to explain something that people had never heard of. And then all of a sudden it's a nightmare. What we've learned from hundreds of thousands of dollars, but not nearly enough, of communications research is in the face of an attack on DEI, if you say, why are people so aggressively interested in dividing us? Diversity to us means pregnant women can have some security on the job that they won't be fired, that there's a curb cut that I can use for my carriage or my wheelchair, or because I'm over 40 and my knees hurt, that I'll be able to get family and medical leave, that, gee, I certainly appreciate the composition of our Olympics team. So if you name, in the face of attack, if you name sort of the negative motivation that the attack comes from and then pivots to all of the people that would be implicated if the attack were believed, you get enormous amount of majority. I see Congresswoman Barbara Comstock is on this call. I'm sorry to call her out, although she's not sorry. She is a leader by nature. She makes this point all the time. She's a conservative, she's a Republican, and is constantly pointing out, number one, the slippery slope of the attacks. Do conservatives not see that if you accept the premise of the attacks on liberals, it's going to harm us? But also broadening the aperture to point out sort of the intended effects of some of our opponents, and that we all need to be in allyship. I'll stop with, I'm consistently wedded to the notion that this is a deeply faithful country. I'm a faithful person. And I think people of faith are constantly open to the possibility that the Sermon on the Mount or the Quran or the Old Testament have sort of a set of morals and values which require communitarianism and looking out for your neighbor. And when reminded of that, people almost always want to lean into that.
Thank you, Robert. Really inspiring. Candace, I would love to hear from you. Should nonprofits be engaging with their policymakers right now to protect their missions? And how do they do that without becoming political targets? What should we be doing right now in terms of reaching out to legislators or the administration?
So I want to re-up a little bit of what Chrissy said earlier about deciding how you want to show up in this moment, because that is a decision to make when you first start reaching out. That does mean you're going to increase your profile. Now, you can decide how you increase your profile, by how much and who you're reaching out to, but that is a affirmative decision that people need to make when they reach out. I will say that obviously there's strength in numbers. And if people across industry are reaching out to their members of Congress and indicating what their concerns are, that drastically decreases the likelihood that you're going to pop on anybody's target. And let's also remember the relative power of members of Congress. Unless they have a committee chair, they probably can't do much to you, even though they can talk a lot on Twitter or X, whatever we're calling it these days. In terms of how to reach out, I think the most important thing is sort of as Robert was saying, when you were talking too theoretically or too much with acronyms, it's really easy for people to make broad statements without actually understanding the impact of what is happening. And I think where we've seen both public opinion and the political discomfort with what's happening is when we put faces and names to stories. So my biggest advice to folks who are thinking about whether to engage the legislature is, number one, do it. And number two, to do it in a way that has both anecdotes and data. Be able to tell your member of Congress why what's happening is so painful, so powerful. If you can give a specific example, I mean, that's what we've seen with Kilmar Abrego Garcia. You know, it's that old statement that one person is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. You got to put a particular story on it. And that actually broke through to a lot of people because they may not care broadly about the number of people that they saw deported to Venezuela. But when you identify one story that's really powerful, that breaks through. But the one story isn't enough. So if you're an organization that is able to demonstrate the breadth of that, you start with the story. You start with the one family at your food bank who can't afford to feed themselves and who now will not be able to get food from you because your grant was cut. And then you expand that to the number of families that you can't help, the number of people in the area that you have helped previously. You have to marry the data with the story and give that not only to your member of Congress, if you live in a red district, but give it to your Democratic members of Congress too, because those are the stories that they're going to use to amplify what's happening and why things are going sideways. Be really careful not to stay too much in the technical, too much in the legal, too much in the broad strokes. If you're going to make a difference, you have to get specific.
Thank you so much, Candace. That's amazing advice. Go ahead, Chrissy.
No, I just add one thought because it all, how it all sort of comes full circle. And we talked a little bit about validators and what we want people to also say and do. And so how you're arming the people in your circles, however broad or narrow you have decided to make yours, is an important piece also. So, if your member of Congress is hearing it from you, but they're also hearing it from other people about whose opinion they care or who are in their orbit or they come across, that's an important piece also. And so, thinking about who are the influencers of the people you're trying to reach, and making sure to the extent that you can, you've armed them with the information. And Candace is absolutely right when she talks about, both there's the head and the heart, right? So some people are moved by stories, some people are moved by numbers. That sweet spot is to have a combination of both so that people can take away what works best for them, but they can carry with them both pieces and share it forward. So really, I mean, we're thinking about each conversation ought not be one conversation. Each conversation ought to prepare us to continue and to sort of play it forward, as it were, so that we can increase our power and reach.
Thank you, Chrissy. And I'm going to ask one last question of our panel here, and then we'll go to some of our questions from our guest here today. I know that our nonprofit's greatest resource are their staff members. And this is a really hard time for all of us as individuals, I would say, almost all of us, I'd imagine. So how at this time can nonprofits maintain their staff morale their donor confidence, community trust when they're potentially caught up in these politically charged narratives, or when, their staff are just feeling beat down from what's happening day in and day out?
So this
Maybe
is
the hardest question of the day.
well, I mean, no, I feel like Candace has taken on the really tough stuff, but I think a lot about, sort of internal communications and sort of how, sort of the culture of an organization, how folks sort of relate to each other is a really important piece of the work, right? I mean, I often say you can't go out and say something publicly if your whole team is like, yeah, that's not right. And so, sort of whether it's in a crisis space, which is, sort of where I do a fair amount of my work, or just in your everyday doings, sort of really making sure that there's a space for people to be heard, and to feel valued, and so sort of to think and talk about not just what's going on, but sort of where that they can feel empowered to take on a piece of it in a way that makes sense and is a fit for sort of your strategy around this moment. And I think that fits to like sort of how you are showing up in community, et cetera, right? That you are that you are really present, even as hard as this is, even as scary as it is, even as divisive as it might feel, pitting us against each other in some respects, is really just to really keep showing up and to encourage ourselves to continue to talk about the work and why it matters and why we do it. So it is the care and caring, that is so much a part of what many of us do, that I think we have to continue to lean on, and we can't let the sort of horrors and the uncertainty and the fear of this moment take us away from who we are and what we do. And so that may be a little Pollyannish, but I think that that is, at our core, we have to be who we are. And I think if we can continue to do that while adding some of these extra pieces that we've talked about today, that we will be successful.
And if I could add on to that, give yourself and each other a lot of grace. This is a marathon. It is not a sprint. At best, we're looking at 2 years. We're more likely looking at 4 years. And I would remind people of that old parable about sharpening your axe, that one where there's two folks who are standing next to each other cutting down trees, and one guy just keeps hacking away and he never stops. And he looks over and the other guy's stopping, and you're like, what are you doing? Why aren't you continuing to try to chop this tree down? And then at the end, the guy who keeps taking breaks is the one who cuts his tree down first. And the one who keeps hacking away looks, that's not fair. I've been working hard this whole time and you've been resting. And the other guy says, I wasn't resting, I was sharpening my axe. And the time he took to sharpen that axe got that tree down faster. So make sure you give yourself that time for you to sharpen your axe, and let your folks, your staff, your people, your friends sharpen their axes too.
Love that.
Snaps. I love that. That's wonderful, Candace. Thank you. That just gives me energy. Having this conversation has been healing for me. So I want to turn to some of our great audience questions, and I'm going to start with a tough but important one, which is that we have seen the administration using anti-Semitism and trying to weaponize anti-Semitism against folks who are doing work with Palestinians, with Palestinian community. And that's something that is, very scary for a lot of organizations that are involved in this type of work. So maybe Robert or potentially Candace, can you all speak to that? What should these organizations who have been involved in work related to Palestine or Gaza be doing right now?
Yeah, first, thank you for so much of the work that you're doing. It's obviously very diverse and as it should be in a free society. The government is hostile to so many of the things that you're interested in. They've made that clear. So sort of that, you don't need us to tell you that. You should sort of know the law. You should work with people who are farther along the curve, having been attacked or harassed or intimidated, to learn sort of best practices on messaging and compliance and document retention and all the things. And get counsel. There's plenty of help out there, no matter your size, and we're happy to help you find that help if you're really struggling with it. A different piece of this is the diversity of the Jewish community in the United States, as in everywhere in the world. And anti-Semitism is a pernicious and consistent scourge across the country. The rates and the incidences are up. It's real. New paragraph. Many of us who are Jewish are not interested in being protected, quote, protected in the way that this government is using the anti-Semitism task force to protect our children. And I think you're seeing an increasing number of Jewish leaders saying some version of not in our name, that one shouldn't conflate protecting young people or others from virulent anti-Semitism, which is horrible, and government should protect us from that. That shouldn't be conflated with cutting off research grants or the various things that we're doing. And you're seeing a real pushback. So for those of you who are sort of doing this work, I'd reach out to those leaders who are willing to speak up. They may be great allies for you, depending on what you face.
Thanks so much, Robert. Um, we have a good question in the chat around how nonprofits can stay. This is, I think, maybe 3 separate questions, but all really good ones. How nonprofits can stay compliant. I know, Candace, you talked a little bit about doing an audit, an internal audit. Can you speak a little bit more about compliance in this moment, and if nonprofits should be changing their sort of processes that they've had in place? What should they be doing regarding compliance?
So this goes back to what I was saying earlier about doing an audit. There are some tools out there that are free or low cost that sort of have you walk through worksheets. I think the National Council of Nonprofits might have one. There might be another one out there that I can find and we can help distribute that will help you go through your own internal processes to figure out whether or not you have crossed that line from C3 to C4. But the other thing you should do is hopefully you've got attorneys on call already or under contract, or accountants who can help you with some of that, whoever helps file your 990s. This is the time to get in deep conversation with those folks and do a scrub, look back a few years. I know for the 501c3 status, the way I mentioned earlier, there's actually a process that's supposed to be followed. Whether they'll follow it, I don't know, but there is a process. And that process is supposed to start at the IRS, where they will do an investigation, usually involving your 990s. That's where they will start. And once they look at those 990s, if they find something there, then they'll issue a decision that will then, you could then appeal internally and then appeal to the courts. But that 990 is really where you start. So you want to go back the last few years and actually do a scrub of that. Hopefully you were following the process you were supposed to at the time, but we all know that sometimes when you do these things routinely, it's really easy to miss things or really easy to get lazy. I'd say look at that 990 in the most ruthless way possible. Like look at it in terms of what can you put in there, what did you put in there that could be interpreted in its worst possible light. That doesn't mean you should change what you wrote, but you need to have an understanding of what someone can do with that information if they pull it out and extract it. So act like you're going for the kill against somebody else, but you're looking at yourself. That's really how you have to do that audit.
Thank you, Candace. That's super helpful. Another part of that question that I thought was very good was around digital security in this moment. I know that's something that a lot of organizations are thinking about. Can y'all speak a little bit to what organizations should be thinking about in terms of their digital footprint and security?
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to say it all off the top, I confess, but I think it is one thinking about, sort of how people are able to access your, sort of systems and whatnot. So what protections you have around whether it's, use of Wi-Fi and other kinds of, sort of back end considerations. I think it is additionally thinking about, sort of what are your internal protocols? And so I do a lot of work in that space, right? Who's able to use and speak on your platforms? What are they able to do and say? What's the approval process around that? That really gets to this whole question about, sort of what your internal, sort of what your voice is intended to be, and to make sure that you don't let your, sort of your external communications channels get ahead of where you are or want to be as an organization. Can you send all staff emails around, right? And again, that has to do with like sort of whether and how, who's speaking for you or about you within the organization. So from that internal perspective, that is a space that I sort of know well. I will confess that some of the other pieces, maybe Candace is a better handle around.
Yeah, I'd break digital security down into two different main categories. The first category to worry about is, are you worried about your digital security for attacks? Like, are you worried about somebody coming in and trying to breach your system, trying to steal your documents? And the other category is, are you worried about it for investigations? Because those are two different concerns and two different kinds of things you're going to want to worry about. From my perspective, having been working in oversight for a while, I focus more on the investigations piece. And with that, you want to think about, what are your document retention policies? If someone comes and asks you for something and you have something from 10 years ago, you're going to be kicking yourself and being like, why didn't I delete that? So think through what your document retention policies are. Think about where you store your documents. If somebody came to you, if Congress or the IRS came to you with a document search, are those documents all in one place? Like, would you actually be able to go and find everything that you needed to legally provide somebody in a fairly easy manner, or are they across different servers? Are they in different offices? How would you actually go and retrieve that information if you had to? So think about those sorts of things. Think about in terms of what you actually have in your Teams chats, if you use Teams, in your WhatsApps, your Slacks. I know a lot of people have been loose, I think, in the past about what they're willing to put in those spaces. And we want those to be spaces of community and of sharing amongst your group. But the old thing that I always heard when I was in government, if you don't want it on the front page of the New York Times, do not write it down. Think about that. And that also goes into what your document retention policy is. Once you get a document request, it is too late. You cannot start deleting things. That's going to be considered destroying evidence, spoliation, violation of various laws or policies. Now is the time to get that digital hygiene in check for the investigation's point of view. From the attacks point of view, I think that goes back to what Chrissy was saying. Are you using platforms or servers that are secure? Usually the Microsoft infrastructure is more secure than, say, the Google infrastructure. One of those is easier to use. One of those is more secure. Understand which one of those is your preference, and where you want to lean in. Understand whether or not you're using business devices or personal devices. Be really careful about whether you're mixing your personal Gmail. Like, are you on the Microsoft system, but actually editing documents in Google and using your personal Gmail for that? That's a problem for the attacks, because if you're doing that, it might not be covered by your business insurance. It might create, blow a hole in the shield that you have built around your company. It's also a problem for investigations, because guess what? You can't go and tell the investigator, oh, I don't use my personal accounts for this stuff, if you've actually been using that. You're same with your personal cell phones. If you get a document request, that's going to blow up your own personal emails and phones for investigation, if that comes in and you have not been clear about your hygiene, about what you're using for business and what you're using for personal. So I'm sure there's a million other things that we could talk about in this digital security space. There are entire digital security consultants who do that. That is not our expertise here at Raben, but obviously we have some collateral skill sets in that area.
So thank you so much. Wow, I really want to thank Robert, Chrissy, and Candace for sharing your wisdom with us all today. I hope everyone has found at least one thing that makes you feel more empowered, more prepared, or less alone. Please check your email. We'll be sending out some follow-up that includes a tip sheet on some of the topics we've discussed today. If you want to speak more with us, please drop us an email. We're at info@raben.co. I saw lots of folks asking for resources in the chat. We would love for you to head to our website, sign up for our newsletter. We'll keep you posted on future resources that we're going to put out and more Raben events like this. There were so many amazing questions that we didn't have time to get to. So we really just want to remain in community with you and continue these conversations as we make it through this time. Please know that we at Raben stand ready to work with any of you who might need a little bit of guidance and support as we move along this path together. In the meantime, we stand in solidarity with you. We encourage you to stay focused on your mission and the people you serve. Your work is more important now than ever. Thank you so much for joining us today.